Chapter 3 The Sexton Beetles. Burl fell headforemost upon the spongy top of a huge toadstool that split with the impact and let him through to the ground beneath, powdering him with its fine spores. He came to rest with his naked shoulder halfway through the yielding flesh of a mushroom stalk, and lay there for a second, catching his breath to scream again. Then he heard the whining buzz of his attempted prey. There was something wrong with the beetle. Burl's spear had struck it in an awkward spot, and it was rocketing upward in erratic flight that ended in a crash 200 or 300 yards away. Burl sprang up in an instant. Perhaps, despite his mistake, he had slain this infinitely more worthy victim. He rushed toward the spot where it had fallen. His wide blue eyes pierced the darkness well enough to enable him to sheer off from masses of toadstools, but he could distinguish no details, nothing but forms. He heard the beetle floundering upon the ground, then heard it mount again into the air more clumsily than before. Its wing beats no longer kept up a sustained note. They thrashed the air irregularly and wildly. The flight was zigzag and uncertain, and though longer than the first had been, it ended similarly in a heavy fall. Another period of floundering, and the beetle took to the air again just before Burl arrived at the spot. It was obviously seriously hurt, and Burl forgot the dangers of the night in his absorption in the chase. He darted after his prey, fleet-footed and agile, taking chances that in cold blood he would never have thought of. Twice in the pain-racked struggles of the monster beetle, he arrived at the spot where the gigantic insect flung itself about madly, insanely, fighting it knew not what, striking out with colossal wings and legs, dazed and drunk with agony, and each time it managed to get aloft in flight that was weaker and more purposeless. Crazy, fleeing from the torturing spear that pierced its very vitals, the beetle blundered here and there, floundering among the mushroom thickets in spasms that were constantly more prolonged and more agonized, but nevertheless flying heavily, lurching drunkenly, managing to graze the tops of the toadstools in one more despairing, tormented flight. And Burl followed, aflame with the fire of the chase, arriving at the scene of each successive, panic-stricken struggle on the ground just after the beetle had taken flight again, but constantly more closely on the heels of the weakening monster. At last he came up panting and found the giant lying upon the earth, moving feebly, apparently unable to rise. How far he was from the tribe, Burl did not know, nor did the question occur to him at the moment. He waited for the beetle to be still, trembling with excitement and eagerness. The struggles of the huge form grew more feeble and at last ceased. Burl moved forward and grasped his spear. He wrenched at it to thrust again. In an instant the beetle had roused itself and was exerting its last atom of strength, galvanized into action by the agony caused by Burl's seizure of the spear. A great wing cover knocked Burl 20 feet and flung him against the base of a mushroom, where he lay half-stunned. But then a strangely pungent scent came to his nostrils, the scent of the red mushrooms. He staggered to his feet and fled, while behind him the gigantic beetle crashed and floundered. Burl heard a tearing and ripping sound. The insect had torn the covering of one of the red mushrooms, tightly packed with the fatal red dust. At the noise, Burl's speed was doubled, but he could still hear the frantic struggles of the dying beetle grow to a very crescendo of desperation. The creature broke free and managed to rise in a final flight, fighting for breath and life, weakened and tortured by the spear and the horrible spores of the red mushrooms. Then it crashed suddenly to the earth and was still. The red dust had killed it. In time to come, Burl might learn to use the red dust as poison gas had been used by his ancestors of 30,000 years before, but now he was frightened and alone, lost from his tribe and with no faintest notion of how to find them. He crouched beneath a huge toadstool and waited for dawn, listening with terrified apprehension for the ripping sound that would mean the bursting of another of the red mushrooms. Only the wing beats of night-flying creatures came to his ears, however, and the discordant noises of the 4-foot truffle beetles as they roamed the aisles of the mushroom forests, seeking the places beneath which their instinct told them fungoid dainties awaited the courageous miner. The eternal dripping of the raindrops falling at long intervals from the overhanging clouds formed a soft obligato to the whole. Burl listened, knowing there were red toadstools all about, but not once during the whole of the long dark hours did the rending noise tell of a bursting fungus casting loose its freight of deadly dust upon the air. Only when day came again, and the chill dampness of the night was succeeded by the steaming humidity of the morning, did a tall pyramid of brownish-red stuff leap suddenly into the air from a ripped mushroom covering. Then Burl stood up and looked around. Here and there, all over the whole countryside, slowly and at intervals, the cones of fatal red sprang into the air. Had Burl lived 30,000 years earlier, he might have likened the effect to that of shells bursting from a leisurely bombardment, but as it was he saw in them only fresh and inexorable dangers added to an already peril-ridden existence. 100 yards from where he had hidden during the night, the body of his victim lay, crumpled up and limp. Burl approached speculatively. He had come even before the ants appeared to take their toll of the carcass, and not even a buzzing flesh-fly had placed its maggots on the unresisting form. The long, whip-like antennae lay upon the carpet of mold and rust, and the fiercely toothed legs were drawn close against the body. The many-faceted eyes stared unseeingly, and the stiff and horny wing cases were rent and torn. When Burl went to the other side of the dead beetle, he saw something that filled him with elation. His spear had been held between his body and the beetle's during that mad flight, and at the final crash, when Burl shot away from the fear-crazed insect, the weight of his body had forced the spear point between the joints of the corselet and the neck. Even if the red dust had not finished the creature, the spear wound in time would have ended its life. Burl was thrilled once more by his superlative greatness, and conveniently forgot that it was the red dust that had actually administered the coup de grace. It was so much more pleasant to look upon himself as the mighty slayer that he hacked off one of the barb-edged limbs to carry back to his tribe in evidence of his feat. He took the long antenna, too, as further proof. Then he remembered that he did not know where his tribe was to be found. He had no faintest idea of the direction in which the beetle had flown. As a matter of fact, the course of the beetle had been in turn directed toward every point of the compass, and there was no possible way of telling the relation of its final landing place to the point from which it had started. Burl wrestled with his problem for an hour and then gave up in disgust. He set off at random with the leg of the huge insect flung over his shoulder and the long antenna clasped in his hand with his spear. He turned to look at his victim of the night before, just before plunging into the nearby mushroom forest, and saw that it was already the center of a mass of tiny black bodies, pulling and hacking at the tough armor and carving out great lumps of the succulent flesh to be carried to the nearby ant city. In the teeming life of the insect world, death is an opportunity for the survivors. There is a strangely tense and fearful competition for the bodies of the slain. There had been barely an hour of daylight in which the ants might seek for provender, yet in that little time the freshly killed beetle had been found and was being skillfully and carefully exploited. When the body of one of the larger insects fell to the ground, there was a mighty rush, a fierce race among all the tribes of scavengers to see who should be first. Usually the ants had come upon the scene and were inquisitively exploring the carcass long before even the flesh flies had arrived, who dropped their living maggots upon the creature. The bluebottles came still later, to daub their masses of white eggs about the delicate membranes of the eye. And while all the preceding scavengers were at work, furtive beetles and tiny insects burrowed below the reeking body to attack the highly scented flesh from a fresh angle. Each working independently of the others, they commonly appeared in the order of the delicacy of the sense which could lead them to a source of food, though accident could, and sometimes did, afford one group of workers in putrescence an advantage over the others. Thus, sometimes a bluebottle anticipated even the eager ants, and again the very flesh flies dropped their squirming offspring upon a limp form that was already being undermined by white-bellied things working in the darkness below the body. Burl grimaced at the busy ants and buzzing flies, and disappeared into the mushroom forest. Here, for a long time, he moved cautiously and silently through the aisles of tangled stalks and the spongy round heads of the fungoids. Now and then he saw one of the red toadstools, and made a wide detour around it. Twice they burst within his sight, circumscribed as his vision was by the toadstools among which he was traveling. Each time he ran hastily to put as much distance as possible between himself and the deadly red dust. He traveled for an hour or more, looking constantly for familiar landmarks that might guide him to his tribe. He knew that if he came upon any place he had seen while with his tribe, he could follow the path they had traveled, and in time rejoin them. For many hours he went on, alert for signs of danger. He was quite ignorant of the fact that there were such things as points of the compass, and though he had a distinct notion that he was not moving in a straight line, he did not realize that he was actually moving in a colossal half-circle. After walking steadily for nearly 4 hours, he was no more than 3 miles in a direct line from his starting point. As it happened, his uncertainty of direction was fortunate. The night before, the tribe had been feeding happily upon one of the immense edible mushrooms when they heard Burl's abruptly changing cry. It had begun as a shout of triumph and ended as a scream of fear. Then they heard hurried wing beats as a creature rose into the air in a scurry of desperation. The throbbing of huge wings ended in a heavy fall, followed by another flight. Velvety darkness masked the sky, and the tribesmen could only stare off into the blackness where their leader had vanished, and begin to tremble, wondering what they should do in a strange country with no bold chief to guide them. He was the first man to whom the tribe had ever offered allegiance, but their submission had been all the more complete for that fact, and his loss was the more appalling. Burl had mistaken their lack of timidity. He had thought it independence and indifference to him. As a matter of fact, it was security, because the tribe felt safe under his tutelage. Now that he had vanished, and in a fashion that seemed to mean his death, their old fears returned to them, reinforced by the strangeness of their surroundings. They huddled together and whispered their fright to one another, listening the while in panic-stricken apprehension for signs of danger. The tribesmen visualized Burl, caught in fiercely toothed limbs, being rent and torn in midair by horny, insatiable jaws, his blood falling in great spurts toward the earth below. They caught a faint, reedy cry and shuddered, pressing closer together. And so, through the long night, they waited in trembling silence. Had a hunting spider appeared among them, they would not have lifted a hand to defend themselves, but would have fled despairingly, would probably have scattered and lost touch with one another, and spent the remainder of their lives as solitary fugitives, snatching fear-ridden rest in strange hiding places. But day came again, and they looked into each other's eyes, reading in each the self-same panic and fear. Saya was probably the most pitiful of all the group. Burl was to have been her mate, and her face was white and drawn beyond that of any of the rest of the tribefolk. With the day they did not move, but remained clustered about the huge mushroom on which they had been feeding the night before. They spoke in hushed and fearful tones, huddled together, searching all the horizon for insect enemies. Saya would not eat, but sat still, staring before her in unseeing indifference. Burl was dead. 100 yards from where they crouched, a red mushroom glistened in the pale light of the new day. Its tough skin was taut and bulging, resisting the pressure of the spores within. But slowly, as the morning wore on, some of the moisture that had kept the skin soft and flaccid during the night evaporated. The skin had a strong tendency to contract, like green leather when drying. The spores within it strove to expand. The opposing forces produced a tension that grew greater and greater as more and more of the moisture was absorbed by the air. At last the skin could hold no longer. With a ripping sound that could be heard for hundreds of feet, the tough wrapping split and tore across its top, and with a hollow booming noise, the compressed mass of deadly spores rushed into the air, making a pyramidal cloud of reddish-brown dust some 60 feet in height. The tribesmen quivered at the noise and faced the dust cloud for a fleeting instant, then ran pell-mell to escape the slowly moving tide of death as the almost imperceptible breeze wafted it slowly toward them. Men and women, boys and girls, they fled in a mad rush from the deadly stuff, not pausing to see that even as it advanced, it settled slowly to the ground, nor stopping to observe its path that they might step aside and let it go safely by. Saya fled with the rest, but without their extreme panic. She fled because the others had done so, and ran more carelessly, struggling with a half-formed idea that it did not particularly matter whether she were caught or not. She fell slightly behind the others without being noticed. Then, quite abruptly, a stone turned under her foot, and she fell headlong, striking her head violently against a second stone. Then she lay quite still, while the red cloud billowed slowly toward her, drifting gently in the faint, hardly perceptible breeze. It drew nearer and nearer, settling slowly, but still a huge and menacing mass of deadly dust. It gradually flattened out, too, so that though it had been a rounded cone at first, it flowed over the minor inequalities of the ground as a huge and tenuous leech might have crawled, sucking from all breathing creatures the life they had within them. 150 yards away, 100 yards away, then only 50 yards away. From where Saya lay unconscious on the earth, eddies within the moving mass could be seen, and the edges took on a striated appearance, telling of the curling of the dust wreaths in the larger mass of deadly powder. The deliberate advance kept on, seemingly almost purposeful. It would have seemed possible to draw from the unhurried, menacing movement of the poisonous stuff that some malign intelligence was concealed in it, that it was in fact a living creature. But when the misty edges of the cloud were no more than 25 yards from Saya's prostrate body, a breeze from one side sprang up, a vagrant, fitful little breeze that first halted the red cloud and threw it into confusion, and then drove it to one side, so that it passed Saya without harming her, though a single trailing wisp of dark red mist floated very close to her. Then, for a time, Saya lay still indeed, only her breast rising and falling gently with faint, irregular breaths. Her head had struck a sharp-edged stone in her fall, and a tiny pool of sticky red had gathered from the wound. Perhaps 30 feet from where she lay, 3 small toadstools stood in a little clump, their bases so close together that they seemed but one. From between 2 of them, however, just where they parted, twin tufts of reddish threads appeared, twinkling back and forth and in and out, as if they had been given some reassuring sign. 2 slender antennae followed, then bulging eyes, and then a small black body which had bright red scalloped markings upon the wing cases. It was a tiny beetle, no more than 8 inches across, a burying beetle. It drew near Saya's body and clambered upon her, explored the ground by her side, moving all the time in feverish haste, and at last dived into the ground beneath her shoulder, casting back a little shower of hastily dug earth as it disappeared. 10 minutes later, another similar insect appeared, and upon the heels of the second, a third. Each of them made the same hasty examination, and each dived under the still form. Presently, the earth seemed to billow at a spot along Saya's side, then at another. Perhaps 10 minutes after the arrival of the third beetle, a little rampart had reared itself all about Saya's body, precisely following the outline of her form. Then her body moved slightly, in a number of tiny jerks, and seemed to settle perhaps half an inch into the ground. The burying beetles were of those who exploited the bodies of the fallen. Working from below, they excavated the earth from the underside of such prizes as they came upon, then turned upon their backs and thrust with their legs, jerking the body so it sank into the shallow excavation they had prepared. The process would be repeated until at last the whole of the gift of fortune had sunk below the surrounding surface, and the loosened earth fell in upon the top, thus completing the inhumation. Then, in the darkness, the beetles would feast and rear their young, gorging upon the plentiful supply of succulent foodstuff they had hidden from jealous fellow scavengers above them. But Saya was alive. 30,000 years before, when scientists examined into the habits of the burying beetles, or the Sexton beetles, they had declared that fresh meat or living meat would not be touched. They based their statement solely upon the fact that the insects, then tiny creatures indeed, did not appear until the trapped meat placed by the investigators had remained untouched for days. Conditions had changed in 30,000 years. The ever-present ants and the sharp-eyed flies were keen rivals of the brightly arrayed beetles. Usually the tribes of creatures who worked in the darkness below ground came after the ants had taken their toll, and the flies sipped daintily. When Saya fell unconscious upon the ground, however, it was the one accident that caused the burying beetle to find her first, before the ants had come to tear the flesh from her slender, soft-skinned body. She breathed gently and irregularly, her face drawn with the sorrow of the night before, while desperately hurrying beetles swarmed beneath her body, channeling away the earth so that she would sink lower and lower into the ground. An inch, and a long wait. Then she sank slowly a second inch. The bright red tufts of thread appeared again, and a beetle made his way to the open air. He moved hastily about, inspecting the progress of the work. He dived below again. Another inch, and after a long time, another inch was excavated. Burl stepped out from a group of overshadowing toadstools and halted. He cast his eyes over the landscape and was struck by its familiarity. It was, in point of fact, very near the spot he had left the night before in pursuit of a colossal wounded beetle. Burl moved back and forth, trying to account for the sensation of recognition, and then trying to approximate the place from which he had last seen it. He passed within 50 feet of the spot where Saya lay, now half buried in the ground. The loose earth cast up about her body had begun to fall in little rivulets upon her. One of her shoulders was already screened from view. Burl passed on, unseeing. He was puzzling over the direction from which he had seen the particular section of countryside before him. Perhaps a little further on he would come to the place. He hurried a little. In a moment he recognized his location. There was the great edible mushroom, half broken away, from which the tribe had been feeding. There were the mining bee burrows. His feet stirred up a fine dust, and he stopped short. A red mushroom had covered the earth with a thin layer of its impalpable, deadly powder. Burl understood why the tribe had gone, and a cold sweat came upon his body. Was Saya safe, or had the whole tribe succumbed to the poisonous stuff? Had they all, men and women and children, died in convulsions of gasping strangulation? He hurried to retrace his footsteps. There was a fragment of mushrooms on the ground. Here was a spear cast away by one of the tribesmen in his flight. Burl broke into a run. The little excavation into which Saya was sinking, inch by inch, was all of 25 feet to the right of the path. Burl dashed on, frantic with anxiety about the tribe, but most of all about Saya. Saya's body quivered and sank a fraction more into the earth. Half a dozen little rivulets of dirt were tumbling upon her body now. In a matter of minutes she would be hidden from view. Burl ran madly past her, too busy searching the mushroom thickets before him with his eyes to dream of looking upon the ground. 20 yards from a huge toadstool thicket, a noise arrested him sharply. There was a crashing and breaking of the brittle, spongy growths. Twin tapering antennae appeared, and then a monster beetle lurched into the open space, its horrible, gaping jaws stretched wide. It was all of 8 feet long, and its body was held up from the ground by 6 crooked, saw-toothed limbs. Its huge, multiple eyes stared with machine-like preoccupation at the world. It advanced deliberately, with a clanking and clashing as of a hideous machine. Burl fled on the instant, running as madly away from the beetle as he had a moment before been running toward it. A little depression in the earth was before him. He did not swerve, but made to leap it. As he shot over it, however, the glint of pink skin caught his eye, and there was impressed upon his brain with photographic completeness the picture of Saya, lying limp and helpless, sinking slowly into the ground, with tiny rills of earth falling down the sides of the excavation upon her. It seemed to Burl's eye that she quivered slightly as he saw. There was a terrific struggle within Burl. Behind him, the colossal, meat-eating beetle. Beneath him, Saya, whom he loved. There was certain death lurching toward him on evilly glittering legs, and there was life for his race and tribe lying in the shallow pit. He turned, aware with a sudden reckless glow that he was throwing away his life, aware that he was deliberately giving himself over to death, and stood on the side of the little pit nearest the great beetle, his puny spear held defiantly at the ready. In his left hand he held just such a leg as those which bore the living creature toward him. He had torn it from the body of just such a monster but a few hours ago, a monster in whose death he had had a share. With a yell of insane defiance, he flung the fiercely toothed limb at his advancing opponent. The sharp teeth cut into the base of one of the beetle's antennae, and it ducked clumsily, then seized the missile in its fierce jaws and crushed it in frenzy of rage. There was meat within it, sweet and juicy meat, that pleased the beetle's palate. It forgot the man standing there waiting for death. It crunched the missile that had attacked it, eating the palatable contents of the horny armor, confusing the blow with the object that had delivered it, and evidently satisfied that an enemy had been conquered and was being devoured. A moment later it turned and lumbered off to investigate another mushroom thicket. And Burl turned quickly and dragged Saya's limp form from the grave that had been prepared for it by the busy insect scavengers. Earth fell from her shoulders, from her hair, and from the mass of yellow fur about her middle, and 3 little beetles with black and red markings scurried in terrified haste for cover, while Burl bore Saya to a resting place of soft mold. Burl was an ignorant savage, and to him Saya's death-like unconsciousness was like death itself. But dumb misery smote him, and he laid her down gently while tears came to his eyes, and he called her name again and again in an agony of grief. For an hour he sat there beside her, a man so lately pleased with himself above all creatures for having slain one huge beetle and put another to flight, as he would have looked upon it, now a broken-hearted little pink-skinned man, weeping like a child, hunched up and bowed over with sorrow. Then Saya slowly opened her eyes and stirred weakly. Chapter 4. The Forest of Death. They were oblivious to everything but each other, Saya resting in still half-incredulous happiness against Burl's shoulder, while he told her in little jerky sentences of his pursuit of the colossal flying beetle, of his search for the tribe, and then his discovery of her apparently lifeless body. When he spoke of the monster that had lurched from the mushroom thicket, and of the desperation with which he had faced it, Saya pressed close and looked at him with wondering and wonderful eyes. She could understand his willingness to die, believing her dead. A little while before, she had felt the same indifference to life. A timid, frightened whisper roused them from their absorption, and they looked up. One of the tribesmen stood upon one foot some distance away, staring at them, almost convinced that he looked upon the living dead. A sudden movement on the part of either of them would have sent him in a panic back into the mushroom forest. 2 or 3 blond heads bobbed and vanished among the tangled stalks. Wide and astonished eyes gazed at the two they had believed the prey of malignant creatures. The tribe had come slowly back to the mushroom they had been eating, leaderless, and convinced that Saya had fallen a victim to the deadly dust. Instead, they found her sitting by the side of their chief, apparently restored to them in some miraculous fashion. Burl spoke, and the pink-skinned people came timorously from their hiding places. They approached warily and formed a half-circle before the seated pair. Burl spoke again, and presently one of the bravest dared approach and touch him. Instantly a babble of the crude and labial language spoken by the tribe broke out. Awed questions and exclamations of thankfulness, then curious interrogations filled the air. Burl, for once, showed some common sense. Instead of telling them in his usual vainglorious fashion of the adventures he had undergone, he merely cast down the 2 long and tapering antennae from the flying beetle that he had torn from its dead body. They looked at them and recognized their origin. Amazement and admiration showed upon their faces. Then Burl rose and abruptly ordered 2 of the men to make a chair of their hands for Saya. She was weak from the effects of the blow she had received. The 2 men humbly advanced and did as they were bid. Then the march was taken up again, more slowly than before, because of Saya as a burden, but none the less steadily. Burl led his people across the country, marching in advance, and with every nerve alert for signs of danger, but with more confidence and less timidity than he had ever displayed before. All that noontime and that afternoon they filed steadily along, the tribesfolk keeping in a compact group close behind Burl. The man who had thrown away his spear had recovered it on an order from Burl, and the little party fairly bristled with weapons, though Burl knew well that they were liable to be cast away as impediments if flight should be necessary. He was determined that his people should learn to fight the great creatures about them, instead of depending upon their legs for escape. He had led them in an attack upon great slugs, but they were defenseless creatures, incapable of more dangerous maneuvers than spasmodic jerkings of their great bodies. The next time danger should threaten them, and especially if it came while their new awe of him held good, he was resolved to force them to join him in fighting it. He had not long to wait for an opportunity to strengthen the spirit of his followers by a successful battle. The clouds toward the west were taking on a dull red hue, which was the nearest to a sunset that was ever seen in the world of Burl's experience, when a bumblebee droned heavily over their heads, making for its hive. The little group of people on the ground looked up and saw a scanty load of pollen packed in the stiff bristles of the insect's hind legs. The bees of the world had a hard time securing food upon the nearly flowerless planet, but this one had evidently made a find. Its crop was nearly filled with hard-gathered, viscous honey destined for the hive's store. It sped onward heavily, its almost transparent wings mere blurs in the air from the rapidity of their vibration. Burl saw its many faceted eyes staring before it in worried preoccupation as it soared in laborious speed over his head some 50 feet up. He dropped his glance, and then his eyes lighted with excitement. A slender-bodied wasp was shooting upward from an ambush it had found in a thicket of toadstools. It darted swiftly and gracefully upon the bee, which swerved and tried to flee. The droning buzz of the bee's wings rose to a higher note as it strove to increase its speed. The more delicately formed wasp headed the clumsier insect back. The bee turned again and fled in terror. Each of the insects was slightly more than 4 feet in length, but the bee was much the heavier, and it could not attain the speed of which the wasp was capable. The graceful form of the hunting insect rapidly overhauled its fleeing prey, and the wasp dashed in and closed with the bee at a point almost over the heads of the tribesmen. In a clawing, biting tangle of thrashing transparent wings and black bodies, the two creatures tumbled to the earth. They fell perhaps 30 yards from where Burl stood watching. Over and over the two insects rolled, now one uppermost and then the other. The bee was struggling desperately to insert her sting in the more supple body of her adversary. She writhed and twisted, fighting with jaw and mandible, wing and claw. The wasp was uppermost, and the bee lay on her back, fighting in panic-stricken desperation. The wasp saw an opening, her jaws darted in, and there was an instant of confusion. Then suddenly the bee, dazed, was upright with the wasp upon her. A movement too quick for the eye to follow, and the bee collapsed. The wasp had bitten her in the neck where all the nerve cords passed, and the bee was dead. Burl waited a moment more, aflame with excitement. He knew, as did all the tribesfolk, what might happen next. When he saw the second act of the tragedy well begun, Burl snapped quick and harsh orders to his spear-armed men, and they followed him in a wavering line, their weapons tightly clutched. Knowing the habits of the insects as they were forced to know them, they knew that the venture was one of the least dangerous they could undertake with fighting creatures the size of the wasp, but the idea of attacking the great creatures whose sharp stings could annihilate any of them with a touch, the mere thought of taking the initiative was appalling. Had their awe of Burl been less complete, they would not have dreamed of following him. The second act of the tragedy had begun. The bee had been slain by the wasp, a carnivorous insect normally, But the wasp knew that sweet honey was concealed in the half-filled crop of the bee. Had the bee arrived safely at the hive, the sweet and sticky liquid would have been disgorged and added to the hive's store. Now, though the bee's journey was ended and its flesh was to be crunched and devoured by the wasp, the honey was the first object of the pirate's solicitude. The dead insect was rolled over upon its back, and with eager haste the slayer began to exploit the body. Burl and his men were creeping nearer, but with a gesture Burl bade them halt for a moment. The wasp's first move was to force the disgorgement of the honey from the bee's crop, and with feverish eagerness it pressed upon the limp body until the shining, sticky liquid appeared. Then the wasp began in ghoulish ecstasy to lick up the sweet stuff, utterly absorbed in the feast. Many thousands of years before, the absorption of the then tiny insect had been noticed when engaged in a similar feat, and it was recorded in books mouldered into dust long ages before Burl's birth, that its rapture was so great that it had been known to fall a victim to a second bandit while engaged in the horrible banquet. Burl had never read the books, but he had been told that the pirate would continue its feast even though seized by a greater enemy, unable to tear itself from the nectar gathered by the creature it had slain. The tribesmen waited until the wasp had begun its orgy, licking up the toothsome stuff disgorged by its dead prey. It ate in gluttonous haste, blind to all sights, deaf to all sounds, able to think of nothing, conceive of nothing but the delights of the liquid it was devouring. At a signal, the tribesmen darted forward. They wavered when near the slender-waisted gourmet, however, and Burl was the first to thrust his spear with all his strength into the thinly armored body. Then the others took courage. A short, horny spear penetrated the very vitals of the wasp. A club fell with terrific impact upon the slender waist. There was a crackling, and the long, spidery limbs quivered and writhed, while the tribesmen fell back in fear, but without cause. Burl struck again, and the wasp fell into two writhing halves, helpless for harm. The pink-skinned men danced in triumph, and the women and children ventured near, delighted. Only Burl noticed that even as the wasp was dying, sundered and pierced with spears, its slender tongue licked out in one last ecstatic taste of the nectar that had been its undoing. Burdened with the pollen-covered legs of the giant bee, and filled with the meat from choice portions of the wasp's muscular limbs, the tribe resumed its journey. This time Burl had men behind him, still timid, still prone to flee at the slightest alarm, but infinitely more dependable than they had been before. They had attacked and slain a wasp whose sting would have killed any of them. They had done battle under the leadership of Burl, whose spear had struck the first blow. Henceforth, they were sharers, in a mild way, of his transcendent glory, and henceforth they were more like followers of a mighty chief, and less like spineless worshippers of a demigod, whose feats they were too timid to emulate. That night they hid among a group of giant puffballs, feasting on the loads of meat they had carried thus far with them. Burl watched them now without jealousy of their good spirits. He and Saya sat a little apart, happy to be near each other, speaking in low tones. After a time, darkness fell, and the tribefolk became shapeless bodies speaking in voices that grew drowsy and were silent. The black forms of the toadstools' heads and huge puffballs were but darker against a dark sky. The nightly rain began to fall, drop by drop, drop by drop, upon the damp and humid earth. Only Burl remained awake for a little while, and his last waking thought was of pride, disinterested pride. He had the first reward of the ruler, gratification in the greatness of his people. The red mushrooms had continued to show their glistening heads, though Burl thought they were less numerous than in the territory from which the tribe had fled. All along the route, now to the right, now to the left, they had burst and sent their masses of deadly dust into the air. Many times the tribe folk had been forced to make a detour to avoid a slowly spreading cloud of death-dealing spores. Once or twice their escapes had been narrow indeed, but so far there had been no deaths. Burl had observed that the mushrooms normally burst only in the daytime, and for a while had thought of causing his followers to do their journeying in the night. Only the obvious disadvantages of such a course, the difficulty of discovering food, and the prowling spiders that roamed in the darkness, had prevented him. The idea still stayed with him, however, and 2 days after the fight with the hunting wasp, he put it in practice. The tribe came to the top of a small rise in the ground. For an hour they had been marching and counter-marching to avoid the suddenly appearing clouds of dust. Once they had been nearly hemmed in, and only by mad sprinting did they escape when 3 of the dull red clouds seemed to flow together, closing 3 sides of a circle. They came to the little hillock and halted. Before them stretched a plain all of 4 miles wide, covered a brownish brick red by masses of mushrooms. They had seen mushroom forests before, and knew of the dangers they presented. But there was none so deadly as the plain before them. To the right and left it stretched as far as the eye could see, but far away on its farther edge Burl caught a glimpse of flowing water. Over the plain itself a dull red haze seemed to float. It was nothing more or less than a cloud of the deadly spores, dispersed and indefinite, constantly replenished by the freshly bursting red mushrooms. While the people stood and watched, a dozen thick columns of dust rose into the air from scattered points here and there upon the plain, settling slowly again, but leaving behind them enough of their finely divided substance to keep the thin red haze over the whole plain in its original deadly state. Burl had seen single red mushrooms before, and even small thickets of 2 or 3, but here was a plain of millions, literally millions upon millions of the malignant growths. Here was one fungoid forest through whose aisles no monster beetles stalked, and above whose shadowed depths no brightly colored butterflies fluttered in joyous abandon. There were no loud-voiced crickets sitting in its hiding places, nor bodies of eagerly foraging ants searching inquisitively for bits of food. It was a forest of death, still and silent, quiet and motionless, save for the sullen columns of red dust that ever and again shot upward from the torn and ragged envelope of the bursting mushroom. Burl and his people watched in wonderment and dismay. But presently a high resolve came to Burl. The mushrooms never burst at night, and the deadly dust from a subsided cloud was not deadly in the morning. As a matter of fact, the rain that fell every night made it no more than a sodden thin film of reddish mud by daylight, mud which dried and caked. Burl did not know what occurred, but knew the result. At night or in early morning, the danger from the red mushrooms was slight. Therefore he would lead his people through the very jaws of death that night. He would lead them through the deadly aisles of this, the forest of malignant growths, the place of lurking annihilation. It was an act of desperation, and the resolution to carry it through left Burl in a state of mind that kept him from observing one thing that would have ended all the struggles of his tribe at once. Perhaps a quarter-mile from the edge of the red forest, 3 or 4 giant cabbages grew, thrusting their colossal leaves upward toward the sky. And on the cabbages a dozen lazy slugs fed leisurely, ignoring completely the red haze that was never far from them and sometimes covered them. Burl saw them, but the oddity of their immunity from the effects of the red dust did not strike him. He was fighting to keep his resolution intact. If he had only realized the significance of what he saw, however. The slugs were covered with a thick, soft fur. The tribespeople wore garments of that same material. The fur protected the slugs and could have made the tribe immune to the deadly red dust if they had only known. The slugs breathed through a row of tiny holes upon their backs, as the mature insects breathed through holes upon the bottom of their abdomens, and the soft fur formed a mat of felt which arrested the fine particles of deadly dust while allowing the pure gas to pass through. It formed, in effect, a natural gas mask which the tribesmen could have adopted, but which they did not discover or invent. The remainder of that day they waited in a curious mixture of resolve and fear. The tribe was rapidly reaching a point where it would follow Burl over a 1,000-foot cliff, and it needed some such blind confidence to make them prepare to go through the forest of the 1,000,000 deadly mushrooms. The waiting was a strain, but the actual journey was a nightmare. Burl knew that the toadstools did not burst of themselves during the night, but he knew that the beetle on which he had taken his involuntary ride had crashed against one in the darkness, and that the fatal dust had poured out. He warned his people to be cautious and led them down the slope of the hill through the blackness. For hours they stumbled on in utter darkness, with the pungent, acrid odor of the red growths constantly in their nostrils. They put out their hands and touched the flabby, damp stalks of the monstrous things. They stumbled and staggered against the leathery skins of the malignant fungoids. Death was all about them. At no time during all the dark hours of the night was there a moment when they could not reach out their hands and touch a fungus growth that might burst at their touch and fill the air with poisonous dust, so that all of them would die in gasping, choking agony. And worst of all, before half an hour was past, they had lost all sense of direction, so that they stumbled on blindly through the utter blackness, not knowing whether they were heading toward the river that might be their salvation, or were wandering hopelessly deeper and deeper into the silent depths of the forest of strangled things. When day came again, and the mushrooms sent their columns of fatal dust into the air, would they gasp and fight for breath in the red haze that would float like a tenuous cloud above the forest? Would they breathe in flames of fire-like torment and die slowly? or would the red dust be merciful and slay them quickly? They felt their way like blind folk, devoid of hope and curiously unafraid. Only their hearts were like heavy, cold weights in their breasts, and they shouldered aside the swollen sacks of the red mushrooms with a singular apathy as they followed Burl slowly through the midst of death. Many times in their journeying, they knew that dead creatures were nearby, moths, perhaps, that had blundered into a distended growth which had burst upon the impact and killed the thing that had touched it. No busy insect scavengers ventured into this plain of silence to salvage the bodies, however. The red haze preserved the sanctuary of malignants inviolate. During the day, no creature might hope to approach its red aisles and dust-carpeted clearings, and at night the slow-dropping rain fell only upon the rounded heads of the mushrooms. In all the space of the forest, only the little band of hopeless people, plodding on behind Burl in the velvet blackness, callously rubbed shoulders with death in the form of the red and glistening mushrooms. Over all the dank expanse of the forest, the only sound was the dripping of the slow and sodden rainfall that began at nightfall and lasted until day came again. The sky began to grow faintly gray as the sun rose behind the banks of overhanging clouds. Burl stopped short and uttered what was no more than a groan. He was in a little circular clearing, and the twisted, monstrous forms of the deadly mushrooms were all about. There was not yet enough light for colors to appear, and the hideous, almost obscene shapes of the loathsome growths on every side showed only as mocking, leering silhouettes as of malicious demons, rejoicing at the coming doom of the gray-faced, huddled tribefolk. Burl stood still, drooping in discouragement upon his spear. The feathery moth's antennae bound upon his forehead shadowed darkly against the graying sky. Soon the mushrooms would begin to burst. Then, suddenly, he lifted his head. Encouragement and delight upon his features. He had heard the ripple of running water. His followers looked at him with dawning hope. Without a word, Burl began to run, and they followed him more slowly. His voice came back to them in a shout of delight. Then they, too, broke into a jog-trot. In a moment they had emerged from the thick tangle of brownish-red stalks, and were upon the banks of a wide and swiftly running river, the same river whose gleam Burl had caught the day before from the farther side of the mushroom forest. Once before Burl had floated down a river upon a mushroom raft. Then his journey had been involuntary and unlooked for. He had been carried far from his tribe and far from Saya, and his heart had been filled with desolation. Now he viewed the swiftly running current with eager delight. He cast his eyes up and down the bank. Here and there the river bank rose in a low bluff, and thick shelf growths stretched out above the water. Burl was busy in an instant, stabbing the hard growths with his spear and striving to wrench them free. The tribesmen stared at him, uncomprehending, but at an order from him they did likewise. Soon a dozen thick masses of firm, light fungus lay upon the shore where it shelved gently into the water. Burl began to explain what they were to do, but one or two of the men dared remonstrate, saying humbly that they were afraid to part from him. If they might embark upon the same thing with him, they would be safe, but otherwise they were afraid. Burl cast an apprehensive glance at the sky. Day was coming rapidly on. Soon the red mushrooms would begin to shoot their columns of deadly dust into the air. This was no time to pause and deliberate. Then Saya spoke softly. Burl listened and made a mighty sacrifice. He took his gorgeous velvet cloak from his shoulders, it was made from the wing of a great moth, and tore it into a dozen long, irregular pieces, tearing it along the lines of the sinews that reinforced it. He planted his spear upright in the largest piece of shelf fungus, and caused his followers to do likewise. Then fastened the strips of sinew and velvet to his spear shaft, and ordered them to do the same with the other spears. In a matter of minutes, the dozen tiny rafts were bobbing on the water, clustered about the larger central bit. Then, one by one, the tribe folk took their places, and Burl shoved off. The agglomeration of cranky, unseaworthy bits of shelf fungus moved slowly out from the shore until the current caught it. Burl and Saya sat upon the central bit, with the other trustful but somewhat frightened pink-skinned people all about them. And as they began to move between the mushroom-lined banks of the river, and the mist of the night began to lift from its surface, far in the interior of the forest of the red fungoids, a column of red leaped into the air. The first of the malignant growths had cast its cargo of poisonous dust into the still humid atmosphere. The cone-like column spread out and grew thin, but even after it had shrunk into the earth, a reddish taint remained in the air about the place where it had been. The deadly red haze that hung all through the day over the red forest was in process of formation. But by that time the unstable fungus crafts were far down the river, bobbing and twirling in the current, with the wide-eyed people upon them gazing in wonderment at the shores as they glided by. The red mushrooms grew less numerous upon the banks. Other growths took their places. Moles and rusts covered the ground as grass had done in ages past. Mushrooms showed their creamy, rounded heads. Malformed things with swollen trunks and branches and strange mockery of the trees they had superseded made their appearance, and once the tribesmen saw the dark bulk of a hunting spider outlined for a moment upon the bank. All the long day they rode upon the current, while the insect life that had been absent in the neighborhood of the Forest of Death made its appearance again. Bees once more droned overhead, and wasps and dragonflies. 4-inch mosquitoes made their appearance, to be fought off by the tribefolk with lusty blows, and glittering beetles and shining flies, whose bodies glittered with a metallic luster, buzzed and flew above the water. Huge butterflies once more were seen, dancing above the steaming, festering earth, in an apparent ecstasy from the mere fact of existence, and all the 1,001 forms of insect life that flew and crawled and swam and dived showed themselves to the tribesmen on the raft. Water beetles came lazily to the surface to snap with sudden energy at mosquitoes busily laying their eggs in the nearby stagnant water by the river banks. Burl pointed out to Saya with some excitement their silver breastplates that shone as they darted under the water again, and the shell-covered boats of 1,000 caddis worms floated in the eddies and backwaters of the stream. Waterboatmen and whirligigs, almost alone among insects in not having shared in the general increase of size, danced upon the oily waves. The day wore on as the shores flowed by. The tribesfolk ate of their burdens of mushroom and meat, and drank from the fresh water of the river. Then, when afternoon came, the character of the country about the stream changed. The banks fell away, and the current slackened. The shores became indefinite, and the river merged itself into a swamp. A vast swamp from which a continual muttering came, which the tribesmen heard for a long time before they saw the swamp itself. The water seemed to turn black, as black mud took the place of the clay that had formed its bed, and slowly, here and there, then more frequently, floating green things that were stationary and did not move with the current appeared. They were the leaves of water lilies that had remained with the giant cabbages and a very few other plants in the midst of a fungoid world. The green leaves were 12 feet across, and any one of them would have floated the whole of Burl's tribe. Presently they grew numerous, so that the channel was made narrow, and the mushroom rafts passed between rows of the great leaves, with here and there a colossal waxen blossom in which 3 men might have hidden, and which exhaled an almost overpowering fragrance into the air. And the muttering that had been heard far away grew in volume to an intermittent, incredibly deep bass roar. It seemed to come from the banks on either side, and actually was the discordant croaking of the giant frogs, grown to 8 feet in length, which lived and loved in the huge swamp, above which golden butterflies danced in ecstasy, and which the transcendently beautiful blossoms of the water lilies filled with fragrance. The swamp was a place of riotous life. The green bodies of the colossal frogs, perched upon the banks in strange immobility, and only opening their huge mouths to emit their thunderous croakings. The green bodies of the frogs blended queerly with the vivid color of the water lily leaves. Dragonflies fluttered in their swift and angular flight above the black and reeking mud. Green bottles and blue bottles and 100 other species of flies buzzed busily in the misty air, now and then falling prey to the licking tongues of the frogs. Bees droned overhead in flight, less preoccupied and worried than elsewhere, flitting from blossom to blossom of the tremendous water lilies, loading their crops with honey and the bristles of their legs with yellow pollen. Everywhere over the mushroom-covered world, the air was never quite free from mist and the steamy exhalations of the pools. But here in the swamps the atmosphere was so heavily laden with moisture that the bodies of the tribesfolk were covered with glistening droplets, while the wide, flat water-lily leaves glittered like platters of jewels from the steam that had condensed upon their upper surfaces. The air was full of shining bodies and iridescent wings. Myriads of tiny midges, no more than 3 or 4 inches across their wings, danced above the slow-flowing water, and butterflies of every imaginable shade and color, from the most delicate lavender to the most vivid carmine, danced and fluttered, alighting upon the white water lilies to sip daintily of their nectar, skimming the surface of the water, enamored of their brightly tinted reflections. And the pink-skinned tribesfolk, floating through this fairyland on their mushroom rafts, gazed with wide eyes at the beauty about them, and drew in great breaths of the intoxicating fragrance of the great white flowers that floated like elfin boats upon the dark water. Chapter 5. Out of Bondage. The mist was heavy and thick, and through it the flying creatures darted upon their innumerable businesses, visible for an instant in all their colorful beauty, then melting slowly into indefiniteness as they sped away. The tribe folk on the clustered rafts watched them as they darted overhead, and for hours the little squadron of fungoid vessels floated slowly through the central channel of the marsh. The river had split into innumerable currents, which meandered purposelessly through the glistening black mud of the swamp, but after a long time they seemed to reassemble, and Burl could see what had caused the vast morass. Hills appeared on either side of the stream, which grew higher and steeper, as if the foothills of a mountain chain. Then Burl turned and peered before him. Rising straight from the low hills, a wall of high mountains rose toward the sky, and the low-hanging clouds met their rugged flanks but halfway toward the peaks. To right and left the mountains melted into the tenuous haze, but ahead they were firm and stalwart, rising and losing their heights in the cloud banks. They formed a rampart which might have guarded the edge of the world, and the river flowed more and more rapidly in a deeper and narrower current toward a cleft between two rugged giants that promised to swallow the water and all that might swim in its depths or float upon its surface. Tall, steep hills rose from either side of the swift current, their sides covered with flaking moles of an exotic shade of rose-pink, mingled here and there with lavender and purple. Rocks, not hidden beneath a coating of fungus, protruded their angular heads from the hillsides. The river valley became a gorge, and then little more than a canyon, with beetling sides that frowned down upon the swift current running beneath them. The small flotilla passed beneath an overhanging cliff, and then shot out to where the cliff sides drew apart and formed a deep amphitheater whose top was hidden in the clouds. And across this open space, on cables all of 500 feet long, a banded spider had flung its web. It was a monster of its tribe. Its belly was swollen to a diameter of no less than 2 yards, and its outstretched legs would have touched 8 points of a 10-yard circle. It was hanging motionless in the center of the colossal snare as the little group of tribe folk passed underneath, and they saw the broad bands of yellow and black and silver upon its abdomen. They shivered as their little crafts were swept below. Then they came to a little valley where yellow sand bordered the river, and there was a level space of 100 yards on either side before the steep sides of the mountains began their rise. Here the cluster of mushroom rafts were caught in a little eddy and drawn out of the swiftly flowing current. Soon there was a soft and yielding jar. The rafts had grounded. Led by Burl, the tribesmen waded ashore, wonderment and excitement in their hearts. Burl searched all about with his eyes. Toadstools and mushrooms, rusts and moles, even giant puffballs grew in the little valley, but of the deadly red mushrooms he saw none. A single bee was buzzing slowly over the tangled thickets of fungoids, and the loud voice of a cricket came in a deafening burst of sound, re-echoed from the hillsides, but, save for the far-flung web of the banded spider a mile or more away, there was no sign of the deadly creatures that preyed upon men. Burl began to climb the hillside with his tribe folk after him. For an hour they toiled upward through confused masses of fungus of almost every species. Twice they stopped to seize upon edible fungi and break them into masses they could carry, and once they paused and made a wide detour around a thicket from which there came a stealthy rustling. Burl believed that the rustling was merely the sound of a moth or butterfly emerging from its chrysalis, but was unwilling to take any chances. He and his people circled the mushroom thicket and mounted higher. And at last, perhaps 600 or 700 feet above the level of the river, they came upon a little plateau, going back into a small pocket in the mountainside. Here they found many of the edible fungoids and no less than a dozen of the giant cabbages, on whose broad leaves many furry grubs were feeding steadily in placid contentment with themselves and all the world. A small stream bubbled up from a tiny basin and ran swiftly across the plateau, and there were dense thickets of toadstools in which the tribesmen might find secure hiding places. The tribe would make itself a new home here. That night they hid among inextricably tangled masses of mushrooms, and saw with amazement the multitude of creatures that ventured forth in the darkness. All the valley and the plateau were illuminated by the shining beacons of huge but graceful fireflies, who darted here and there in delight and, apparently, in security. Upon the earth below, also, many tiny lights glowed. The larvae of the fireflies crawled slowly but happily over the fungus-covered mountainside, and great glowworms clambered upon the shining tops of the toadstools and rested there, twin broad bands of bluish fire burning brightly within their translucent bodies. They were the females of the firefly race, which never attain to legs and wings, but crawl always upon the earth, merely enlarged creatures in the forms of their own larvae. Moths soared overhead with mighty throbbing wing beats, and all the world seemed a paradise through which no evil creatures roamed in search of prey. And a strange thing came to pass. Soon after darkness fell upon the earth and the steady drip-drop of the rain began, a musical tinkling sound was heard which grew in volume, and became a deep-toned roar, which re-echoed and reverberated from the opposite hillsides, until it was like melodious and long-continued thunder. For a long time the people were puzzled and a little afraid, but Burl took courage and investigated. He emerged from the concealing thicket and peered cautiously about, seeing nothing. Then he dared move in the direction of the sound, and the gleam from a dozen fireflies showed him a sheet of water pouring over a vertical cliff to the river far below. The rainfall, gentle as it was, when gathered from all the broad expanse of the mountainside, made a river of its own, which had scoured out a bed and poured down each night to plunge in a smother of spray and foam through 600 feet of empty space to the swiftly flowing river in the center of the valley. It was this sound that had puzzled the tribefolk, and this sound that lulled them to sleep when Burl at last came back to allay their fears. The next day they explored their new territory with a boldness of which they would not have been capable a month before. They found a single great trapdoor in the earth, sure sign of the burrow of a monster spider, and Burl resolved that before many days the spider would be dealt with. He told his tribesmen so, and they nodded their heads solemnly instead of shrinking back in terror, as they would have done not long since. The tribe was rapidly becoming a group of men capable of taking the aggressive. They needed Burl's rash leadership, and for many generations they would need bold leaders, but they were infinitely superior to the timid, rabbit-like creatures they had been. They bore spears, and they had used them. They had seen danger and had blindly followed Burl through the forest of strangled things instead of fleeing weakly from the peril. They wore soft, yellow fur about their middles, taken from the bodies of giant slugs they had slain. They had eaten much meat and preferred its succulent taste to the insipid savor of the mushrooms that had once been their steady diet. They knew the exhilaration of brave adventure, though they had been forced into adventure by Burl, and they were far more worthy descendants of their ancestors than those ancestors had known for many 1,000 years. The exploration of their new domain yielded many wonders and a few advantages. The tribe folk found that the nearest ant city was miles away, and that the small insects would trouble them but rarely. The nightly rush of water down the sloping sides of the mountain made it undesirable for the sight of an ant colony. And, best of all, back in the little pocket in the mountainside, they found old and disused cells of hunting wasps. The walls of the pocket were made of soft sandstone with alternate layers of clay, and the wasps had found digging easy. There were a dozen or more burrows, the shaft of each some 4 feet in diameter and going back into the cliff for nearly 30 feet, where they branched out into a number of cells. Each of the cells had once held a grub which had grown fat and large upon its hoard of paralyzed crickets, and then had broken away to the outer world to emerge as a full-grown wasp. Now, however, the laboriously tunneled caverns would furnish a hiding place for the tribe of men, a far more secure hiding place than the center of the mushroom thickets, and furthermore, a hiding place which, because more permanent, would gradually become a possession for which the men would fight. It is a curious thing that the advancement of a people from a state of savagery and continual warfare to civilization and continual peace is not made by the elimination of the causes of strife, but by the addition of new objects and ideals, in defense of which that same people will offer battle. A single chrysalis was found securely anchored to the underside of a rock shelf, and Burl detached it with great labor and carried it into one of the burrows, though the task was one that was almost beyond his strength. He desired the butterfly that would emerge for his own use. He preempted, too, a solitary burrow a little distant from the others, and made preparations for an event that was destined to make his plans wiser and more far-reaching than before. His followers were equally busy with their various burrows, gathering stores of soft growth for their couches, and later, at Burl's suggestion, even carrying within the dark caverns the radiant heads of the luminous mushrooms to furnish illumination. The light would be dim, and after the mushroom had partly dried it would cease, but for a people utterly ignorant of fire it was far from a bad plan. Burl was very happy for that time. His people looked upon him as a savior, and obeyed his least order without question. He was growing to repose some measure of trust in them, too, as men who began to have some glimmerings of the new-found courage that had come to him, and which he had striven hard to implant in their breasts. The tribe had been a formless gathering of people. There were 6 or 7 men and as many women, and naturally families had come into being. sometimes after fierce and absurd fights among the men, but the families were not the sharply distinct agreements that would have been in a tribe of higher development. The marriage was but an agreement, terminable at any time, and the men had but little of the feeling of parenthood, though the women had all the fierce maternal instinct of the insects about them. These burrows in which the tribe folk were making their homes would put an end to the casual nature of the marriage bonds. They were homes in the making, damp and humid burrows without fire or heat, but homes nevertheless. The family may come before the home in the development of mankind, but it invariably exists when the home has been made. The tribe had been upon the plateau for nearly a week when Burl found that stirrings and strugglings were going on within the huge cocoon he had laid close beside the burrow he had chosen for his own. He cast aside all other work and waited patiently for the thing he knew was about to happen. He squatted on his haunches beside the huge oblong cylinder, his spear in his hand, waiting patiently. From time to time he nibbled at a bit of edible mushroom. Burl had acquired many new traits, among which a little foresight was most prominent, but he had never conquered the habit of feeling hungry at any and every time that food was near at hand. He had to wait. He had food, therefore he ate. The sound of scrapings came from the closed cocoon, caked upon its outer side with dirt and mold. The scrapings and scratchings continued, and presently a tiny hole showed, which rapidly enlarged. Tiny jaws and a dry, glazed skin became visible, the skin looking as if it had been varnished with many coats of brown shellac. Then a malformed head forced its way through and stopped. All motion ceased for a matter of half an hour. Then the strange, blind head seemed to become distended, to be swelling. A crack appeared along its upper part, which lengthened and grew wide, and then a second head appeared from within the first. This head was soft and downy, and a slender proboscis was coiled beneath its lower edge, like the trunk of one of the elephants that had been extinct for many thousand years. Soft scales and fine hairs alternated to cover it, and two immense, many-faceted eyes gazed mildly at the world on which it was looking for the first time. The color of the whole was purest milky white. Slowly and painfully, assisting itself by slender, colorless legs that seemed strangely feeble and trembling, a butterfly crawled from the cocoon. Its wings were folded and lifeless, without substance or color, but the body was a perfect white. The butterfly moved a little distance from its cocoon and slowly unfurled its wings. With the action, life seemed to be pumped into them from some hidden spring in the insect's body. The slender antennae spread out and wavered gently in the warm air. The wings were becoming broad expanses of snowy velvet. A trace of eagerness seemed to come into the butterfly's actions. Somewhere there in the valley, sweet food and joyous companions awaited it. Fluttering above the fungoids of the hillsides, surely there was a mate with whom the joys of love were to be shared. Surely upon those gigantic patches of green, half hidden in the haze, there would be laid tiny golden eggs that in time would hatch into small, fat grubs. Strength came to the butterfly's limbs. Its wings were spread and closed with a new assurance. It spread them once more, and raised them to make the first flight of this new existence in a marvelous world full of delights and adventures. Burl struck home with his spear. The delicate limbs struggled in agony, the wings fluttered helplessly, and in a little while the butterfly lay still upon the fungus-carpeted earth, and Burl leaned over to strip away the great wings of snow-white velvet, to sever the long and slender antennae, and then to call his tribesmen and bid them share in the food he had for them. And there was a feast that afternoon. The tribesmen sat about the white carcass, cracking open the delicate limbs for the meat within them, and Burl made sure that Saya secured the choicest bits. The tribesmen were happy. Then one of the children of the tribe stretched a hand aloft and pointed up the mountainside. Coming slowly down the slanting earth was a long, narrow file of living animals. For a time the file seemed to be but one creature, but Burl's keen eyes soon saw that there were many. They were caterpillars, each one perhaps 10 feet long, each with a tiny black head armed with sharp jaws, and with dull red fur upon their backs. The rear of the procession was lost in the mist of the low-hanging cloud banks that covered the mountainside some 2,000 feet above the plateau, but the foremost was no more than 300 yards away. Slowly and solemnly the procession came on, the black head of the second touching the rear of the first, and the head of the third touching the rear of the second. In faultless alignment, without intervals, they moved steadily down the slanting side of the mountain. Save the first, they seemed absorbed in maintaining their perfect formation, but the leader constantly rose upon his hinder half and waved the forepart of his body in the air, first to the right and then to the left, as if searching out the path he would follow. The tribesfolk watched in amazement mingled with terror. Only Burl was calm. He had never seen a slug that meant danger to man, and he reasoned that these were at any rate moving slowly so that they could be distanced by the fleeter-footed human beings, but he also meant to be cautious. The slow march kept on. The rear of the procession of caterpillars emerged from the cloud bank, and Burl saw that a shining white line was left behind them. No less than 80 great caterpillars, clad in white and dingy red, were solemnly moving down the mountainside, leaving a path of shining silk behind them. Head to tail, in single file, they had no eyes or ears for anything but their procession. The leader reached the plateau and turned. He came to the cluster of giant cabbages and ignored them. He came to a thicket of mushrooms and passed through it, followed by his devoted band. Then he came to an open space where the earth was soft and sandy, where sandstone had weathered and made a great heap of easily moved earth. The leading caterpillar halted and began to burrow experimentally in the ground. The result pleased him, and some signal seemed to pass along the 800-foot line of creatures. The leader began to dig with feet and jaws, working furiously to cover himself completely with the soft earth. Those immediately behind him abandoned their formation and pressed forward in haste. Those still farther back moved more hurriedly. All, when they reached the spot selected by the leader, abandoned any attempt to keep in line, and hastened to find an unoccupied spot in the open space in which to bury themselves. For perhaps half an hour the clearing was the scene of intense activity, incredible activity. Huge 10-foot bodies burrowed desperately in the whitish earth, digging frantically to cover themselves. After the half hour, however, the last of the caterpillars had vanished. Only an occasional movement of the earth, from the struggle of a buried creature to bury itself still deeper, and the freshly turned surface, showed that beneath the clearing on the plateau 80 great slugs were preparing themselves for the sleep of metamorphosis. The piled-up earth and the broad white band of silk, leading back up the hillside until it became lost in the clouds, alone remained to tell of the visitation. The tribesmen had watched in amazement. They had never seen these creatures before, but they knew, of course, why they had entombed themselves. Had they known what the scientists of 30,000 years before had written in weighty and dull books, they would have deduced from the appearance of the processionary caterpillars, or pine caterpillars, that somewhere above the bank of clouds there were growing trees and sunlight, that a moon shone down, and stars twinkled from the blue vault of a cloudless sky. But the tribesmen did not know. They only knew that there, beneath the soft earth, was a mighty store of food for them when they cared to dig for it, that their provisions for many months were secure, and that Burl, their leader, was a great and mighty man for having led them to this land of safety and plenty. Burl read their emotions in their eyes, but better than their amazement and wonderment was a glance that had nothing whatever to do with his leadership of the tribe. And then Burl rose and took the 2 snowy white velvet cloaks from the wings of the white butterfly. One of them he flung about his own shoulders, and the other he flung about Saya. And then those 2 stood up before the wide-eyed tribesmen, and Burl spoke. "This is my mate, and my food is her food, and her wrath is my wrath. My burrow is her burrow, and her sorrow is my sorrow. Men whom I have led to this land of plenty, hear me. As ye obey my words, see to it that the words of Saya are obeyed likewise, for my spear will loose the life of any man who angers her. Know that as I am great beyond all other men, so Saya is great beyond all other women, for I say it, and it is so." And he drew Saya toward him, trembling slightly, and put his arm about her waist before all the tribe, and the tribesmen muttered in acquiescent whispers that what Burl said was true, as they had already known. Then, while the pink-skinned men feasted on the meat Burl had provided for them, he and Saya went toward the burrow he had made ready. It was not like the other burrows, being set apart from them, and its entrance was bordered on either side by mushrooms as black as night. All about the entrance the black mushrooms clustered, a strange species that grew large and scattered its spores abroad, and then of its own accord melted into an inky liquid that flowed away, sinking slowly into the ground. In a little hollow below the opening of the burrow, an inky pool had gathered, which reflected the gray clouds above and the shapes of the mushrooms that overhung its edges. Burl and Saya made their way toward the burrow in silence, a picturesque couple against the black background of the sable mushrooms and the earth made dark by the inky liquid. Both of their figures were swathed in cloaks of unsmirched whiteness and wondrous softness, and bound to Burl's forehead were the feathery, lace-like antennae of a great moth, making flowing plumes of purest gold. His spear seemed cast from bronze, and he was a proud figure as he led Saya past the black pool and to the doorway of their home. They sat there, watching, while the darkness came on and the moths and fireflies emerged to dance in the night, and listened when the rain began its slow, deliberate dripping from the heavy clouds above. Presently a gentle rumbling began, the accumulation of the rain from all the mountainside, forming a torrent that would pour in a 600-foot drop to the river far below. The sound of the rushing water grew louder, and was echoed back from the cliffs on the other side of the valley. The fireflies danced like fairy lights in the chasm, and all the creatures of the night winged their way aloft to join in the ecstasy of life and love. And then, when darkness was complete, and only the fitful gleams of the huge fireflies were reflected from the still surface of the black pool beneath their feet, Burl reached out his hand to Saya, sitting beside him in the darkness. She yielded shyly, and her soft, warm hand found his in the obscurity, and Burl bent over and kissed her on the lips. End of chapter 5.